Guardians? Today we're covering 4 meta hunter builds that will absolutely dominate endgame content in Destiny 2. These builds will offer you everything from a ton of ad control, ways to stack over 90% damage resistance, and even ways to deal a ton of boss DPS. Let's get into it. And with the first build on the list, it's all about dealing as much damage to bosses as possible, making it perfect for those raid and dungeon scenarios. And it all revolves around the exotic helmet, Celestial Nighthawk, which turns your Golden Gun super into one powerful shot that does 72% more damage than the regular 3 shots. This is the best option for DPS supers when running Prismatic Hunter. The best part is when you pair this with the Still Hunt Exotic Sniper, it also becomes one powerful shot. Its overall damage is only increased by 2%, though it does save you some time, which does increase its overall DPS. Right now, my favorite way to use this is to pair it with a good stasis primary and the incredibly strong chill inhibitor. And if you've completed at least one run of Vesper Host, you can go to Banshee and pick up that god roll for the chill inhibitor. With this setup, you can deal a ton of boss damage, but it also makes DPS phases incredibly simple, which we will break down in a second. As for the rest of the build, we bring facets of Dawn and Courage so that we can get even more damage out of our supers. And then we bring facet of Protection and Purpose to gain more survivability from damage resistance and restoration. Pair all of this with a stasis primary that has Rhyme Stealer and Headstone, and now you have constant healing and stacking damage resistance. And I love bringing the Threaded Spike melee, which not only refunds itself and makes you radiant, but will also sever targets on hits, making them deal 40% less damage. So what's the flow for this build? Well, when going into a DPS phase, make sure to pre-pop your Transcendence and immediately throw a grenade and melee to not only deal more damage, but also proc Radiant, Facet of Courage, and Severing the boss. Then pop your Golden Gun and immediately pop your Cade's Retribution. Make sure to then shoot once with your primary and immediately switch to your heavy weapon so that you can proc Bait and Switch and go to town. Once out of ammo, swap back to Still Hunt and shoot until you hit your super again and start that cycle over again. As for improving the build, for stats, I shoot for 100 resilience and discipline. Then I go for roughly 50 to 60 in intellect and strength. We've already kind of touched on what weapons to run, so for the artifact, there aren't many perks that can really help this build out this season. So that means that this build will only get stronger in other seasons that are either solar based or sniper based. This build stands out for its pure damage potential, making it one of the best dungeon and raid builds out there. Listen, I've heard you in the comment section saying it's harder to play Destiny on console than on a PC, and that's why I'm partnering with Apex Gaming PCs to bring you a lineup of custom built PCs that will elevate your gaming experience. Listen, I love on the couch console gaming just as much as the next guy, but the fact of the matter is, when it comes to beautiful graphics and high frame rates, PC gaming is just chef's kiss. And with the Streamer Plus model, you'll have all the power you need to take on any new games that come out. You can use code LUCKY to save 10% at checkout. With that being said, let's jump right back into the video. And the second build that we're looking at is all about taking advantage of the new artifact perks. In Act 2, we got 2 amazing artifact perks. First up is Curative Orbs. When boosted with a tonic, it will make it so that picking up an Orb of Power or Elemental pickup will restore some health. And the other one is Arc Compounding, which makes it so that we deal increased arc damage against blinded enemies. So this build aims to create a ton of Ionic Traces that will heal you and provide you with a ton of ability energy. It will then let you blind and jolt targets. That way you can get the most amount of arc damage as possible. And to top it all off, we have a ton of damage resistance, and that comes from our exotic, Gifted Conviction. The main advantage this gives is that when you jolt a target, you'll gain stacking damage resistance, capping out at 4 stacks, which is equivalent to 50% damage resistance. You'll be able to jolt enemies with your grenade, melee, and even your weapons, meaning that this damage resistance should basically always be active. And this build revolves around your melee. No, not that melee. I'm talking about that melee. With Tempest Strike, you send out a wave of arc energy that will damage and jolt enemies, and when paired with Gifted Conviction, you'll also get some extra damage with 3 added arc projectiles. We then become amplified by killing a jolted target, which procs Flow State to gain 200% class ability regen. That way we can constantly spam our melee into our dodge and then back into our melee. The whole time you'll be creating a ton of Ionic Traces from Spark of Ions and Discharge charge, feeding back into all of your abilities and healing you. So what's the flow for this build? Well, I love to start by using my Tempest Strike to immediately become amplified and proc our first level of damage resistance. If you have more enemies to take care of, dodge near them to gain back your melee, and then use Tempest Strike again. If you don't have either of those available, you can use your grenade or your primary weapon to take them out. Whenever you come across a boss or mini boss, throw your Gathering Storm to quickly take them out. It's honestly such a simple yet effective build. And when it comes to improving the build for stats, I shoot for 100 in resilience. Then I go for a split of intellect, discipline, strength, and mobility. Yes, I know, that's basically all of them. Remember, Ionic Traces give you back ability energy for all 3 abilities. So if we split our stats, we can easily cycle between all 3. For weapons, you do have plenty of options to work with. In the energy slot, we want to bring an arc weapon that can proc Jolt. Ideally, this is a weapon with jolting feedback, so that you don't need to get a kill in order to proc it, but Volt Shot can do the job too. Grand Overture is going to be absolutely busted in Act 2 and 3, and that's because when you have the Catalyst, its missiles will blind enemies, leading to even more arc damage. You could alternatively run Centrifuge to constantly blind enemies, making normal enemies take more arc damage, and to not shoot back at you. For the artifact, we want to bring Trace Evidence, which will help you create even more Ionic Traces, just by hitting precision hits on jolted or blinded targets. And if you have a teammate proccing stasis debuffs, then Conductive Cosmic Crystal will let you deal 5% more damage with your arc abilities, or up to 8% when you boost it. As mentioned before, we want to bring Curative Orbs for healing, and then also bring Arc Compounding for even more boss DPS. This build excels in nearly all facets of the game, and can even be used in hard content like Grandmaster Nightfalls or Expert Onslaught. And the inspiration for this build came from Llama's video, which covers a version of it using the reworked Raiju's harness for a ton of super regen. Link to his build and channel in the description. Hey you! Yeah, you! Are you enjoying the video? If so, remember to leave a like on the video and consider hitting that subscribe button. For the next build on the list, we have a Mothkeeper Wraps build that has already received a major buff this season, and just got even stronger with the artifact. With Mothkeeper's Wraps, your grenade becomes a moth cage that sends out 2 moths that can either be arc or void. Void moths will fly to the closest ally, giving them a 22 hit point void over shield. On the other hand, arc moths will fly to the closest enemy, dealing damage and blinding them, meaning that we will constantly blind enemies, increasing all of our arc damage from the new artifact perk, Arc Compounding. Like with the Still Hunt build, with this build we're bringing a weapon that synergizes perfectly with our exotic armor, and that is the Exterius Grenade Launcher. Intrinsically, this weapon already creates an Arc Moth on kills or 2 direct hits, but now it will also spawn a Void Moth, giving you and your team more survivability. We then bring Facet of Awakening to create Ionic Traces, and Facet of Dominance to have our moths also jolt enemies. We get a ton of survivability just from the Void Overshield, but we can compound on this by bringing Facet of Mending paired with Gunpowder Gamble. Now any and all grenade kills give us 70 health. Top it all off with the Silk Strike Super for ad clearing, and then Facet of Purpose to gain Woven Mail for that 45% damage resistance that can stack with the damage resistance from Void Overshields. When you account for Woven Mail, Void Overshield, Transcendence, Facet of Protection, and even Frost Armor from Rhyme Stealer, you can get up to 91% damage resistance. While this won't be active all the time, you can count on constantly having your Void Overshield and Woven Mail active, which still is 84% damage resistance. As for the flow for the build, this build is pretty straightforward and easy to use. Whenever you get your abilities, use them. Grenades will heal you, provide you with Overshield, and a ton of damage, not to mention also blinding enemies. Your melee will weaken enemies, making it easier to proc Devour from this season's artifact. And whenever you get back that Gunpowder Gamble, chuck it at a group of enemies to wipe them out. In the meantime, use your Exterius Grenade Launcher to constantly create moths that will provide all the previously mentioned benefits. As for improving the build, for stats, I'm shooting for 100 in resilience and discipline. Then I go for a split of strength and intellect, with any leftover stats going into mobility. And as for those weapons, in the primary slot, you can bring a stasis weapon with Headstone and Rhyme Stealer. That way you can easily proc Frost Armor to gain even more stacking damage resistance. And in the heavy slot, you can bring any heavy weapon that you want, but Chill Inhibitor is one of the best options. As for the artifact, there are a couple perks that we do want to bring. First up, we want to bring Conductive Cosmic Crystal and Arc Compounding to get get even more damage from our arc abilities on stasis and arc debuff targets. You can also bring trace evidence to create ionic traces by getting precision hits on enemies affected by your moths. And you can also bring concussive reload, since it'll give you an easy way to weaken bosses, champions, or even by breaking an enemy shield. And finally, you can bring power from pain, so that rapidly killing 3 weakened enemies will give you devour, giving you more health and grenade energy on kills, which can be easily procced from your smoke bomb. This build has gotten some pretty major buffs this season, with Void Overshield, the Xdearus rework, and now with all of the artifact synergy, offering you a ton of survivability, ad clearing potential, and ad control. And with the final build, we have a twist on a classic hunter build. This Orpheus Rigs build is meant for Grandmaster Nightfalls, Expert Onslaught, and any other activity that is ad dense. With Orpheus Rigs, you get back up to 50% of your super just by tethering enemies. So we aim to get back our super as quick as possible to allow us to deal 30% more damage to all enemies and provide you a ton of ad control. We bring Facet of Bravery to gain volatile rounds for our void weapons by getting grenade kills, and then we bring Facet of Dawn to become radiant by getting powered melee hits. This allows us to deal a ton more damage with our void weapons and create a ton of orbs in the process from Harmonic Siphon, which will only feed back into more super energy. You have a ton of survivability with Facet of Purpose to gain a Void Overshield every time you pick up an orb, and that paired with Stylus Executioner means you can go invisible anytime you defeat a debuff target, and you can even stun all 3 champs. For barrier champs, you can use a powered melee to go radiant, or get a grenade kill to proc those volatile rounds. For unstoppable champs, you can either use your Gunpowder Gamble grenade, or you can transcend to cause an ignition or to freeze with your Prismatic grenade. And for those overload champs, you can transcend and use your Prismatic grenade to slow them, or your tether will also suppress them. And what's the flow for this build? Well, you want to remember to constantly use your super to lock down areas and create a ton of orbs for your team. In the mid-game rotation, you want to constantly use your grenades to proc volatile rounds for your void weapons, killing as quickly as possible to gain back a ton of super energy and create even more orbs. It helps if you have teammates that are also using their supers, so you can chain off of each other, but that's honestly not even necessary. And when it comes to improving the build, for stats I shoot for 100 resilience, then I go for at least 70 intellect to increase our super regen rate, and finish it all off with as high of discipline as possible. Since this build uses volatile rounds, I like to bring void weapons in the energy and heavy slot. In that primary slot, you can bring a chill clip weapon, like a grenade launcher or the new rocket assisted sidearm coming with Iron Banner for some extra champion stunning capabilities. Graviton Lance pairs perfectly with this build, but in the off chance you don't want to use it, the Velocity Baton is an area denial grenade launcher that can deal a ton of damage when you have volatile rounds active, and finish it off with Edge Transit to deal a ton of boss damage. As for the artifact, Total Carnage paired with Debilitating Wave is really good if you don't mind doing finishers, providing you with stacking damage resistance, extra void damage, and a weakening burst when boosted. Curative Orbs is also really strong, offering you another way to create orbs, and when boosted, it will make it so that orbs will heal you on pickup, and then you can also bring Kinetic Impacts to deal a bit more damage with your Edge Transit. Tether Spam has been and always will be really strong in ad dense environments. If you don't have access to the Prismatic subclass, you can always run a version of this build on the Void subclass. If you want to see a more in-depth version of this build, then go check out this video here. And there you have it, Guardians. We've covered 4 hunter builds that will help you conquer any endgame activity. If you want to see 4 Warlock builds or 4 Titan builds that can do the same thing, then go check out either of these videos. Remember, mastering these builds is only the beginning. Experiment with different combinations and tweak your loadouts to suit your playstyle. Found this video helpful or just enjoyed seeing a new perspective? Feel free to like the video and comment down below on what builds you've been enjoying most for hunters. Keep an eye out for future videos as we continue to explore the ever-evolving world of Destiny 2. Until then, may the threads of fate be ever in your favor. This is Lucky Mech signing off. See you on the next adventure, Guardians.